Troubleshooting and error handling. In the last couple nuggets, we were creating these ETL operations under perfect circumstances. We were making an assumption here that everything was always going to go smoothly. Well, that's not always the case. In fact, if something can go wrong, it will, and we need to understand how to troubleshoot these situations and perform error handling. So in this nugget, we're first of all going to talk about logging, how to write either to a text file or an XML file or a database table to give you information about what's going on with your SSIS. We're also going to take a look at the error output. Up until now, all those arrows you've been dealing with have only been green. In other words, when you're flowing from one task to another, you're assuming that everything is going to go smoothly. Well, remember when we were looking at those tasks, there's also a red arrow, and that represents the error output. And so I'll show you how to configure that to write information to a file or to somewhere else if something goes wrong. Then we'll take a look at our data viewer. This data viewer lets us peek into the data flow going from one task to another. For example, if we create a data viewer that goes between a lookup table and the output, we can see what kind of transformations are taking place. Then we'll take a look at our debugger. Yes, we have been using the debugger in the last two nuggets, but only in a very simplistic fashion. I'll show you how to set your checkpoints and how to step into the different tasks, or if you need to step over tasks. We'll also take a look at checkpointing and transactions. Now you can create your tasks to be enclosed inside of a transaction, so if one of them fails, then all of them fail and everything gets rolled back. You can also implement checkpointing. When you set up a checkpoint, what you're doing is you're saying, hey, you know what, if we have all these tasks and one of them fails in the middle, then the next time we execute our package, it will continue at that location. Let's get started with our logging. I'm going to go to my Business Intelligence Development Studio right here, and what we're looking at is this for each file loop that we created earlier, and really you can do this with anything. You just need to have some kind of task in here, and we're going to try to implement some logging. Okay, so to do that, make sure that you have your control flow highlighted, make sure you have that tab highlighted, and then right click on here and go to logging. Okay, so under logging you'll see that we have containers here. We have our package container, we have the for each file loop, and we have the extract from flat file. We'll go ahead and just check all of these to mean that we're going to log on every level there. Now, we have different types of log providers. We have one for logging in Windows events. We can log to a text file, to an XML file, to SQL Server, or to SQL Server Profiler. I'm going to choose the simplest option here, which is the text file, and we say Add. Okay, so we'll go ahead and click that. You can change this name if you want to, or leave it the same. And I'm going to go in here, and under Configuration, we can create a new connection. Now yours probably is not going to have this logging file down here, but let me just step you through this. We can say new connection, and we can create a file, and we can just specify any directory. It's going to fail if you provide a directory that doesn't exist. Okay, so let's just put this directly under the C drive, and I'll call this mytestlog.txt. Okay, so now we need to specify what we want to log. Well, we'll go into details, and these are all the possible things we can log. It's going to be a little bit verbose if there's a lot of activity going on. For right now, I do want to have everything checked just so we can have something written to that file. Okay, so at this point, we can say OK on there. And now we can go ahead and run the debugger. The logging should occur automatically. We have some red here, which means an error occurred. My guess is that it was a primary key validation issue. I'm going to open up my TextPad, and I'll go to the file that we just created, which was my testlog.txt, and I'll just pull this over here, and you can see that, yes, it indeed logged all this information. Okay, so you'll see it shows you the conditions on which it was logging. Some of these are just diagnostic messages. If you scroll down far enough, you'll see something that has to do with errors. There we go, on error. Okay, as I mentioned, not much was happening in our little task there. However, we did turn on the logging for everything. That's why it was so verbose. Let's turn off our debugger. So now you understand how to turn on your logging. The next thing I want to talk about is error output. Okay, let's hone in on this data flow right here. And you'll see here we were just extracting information from the contacts file. It was a flat file. We were looking up the postal code, and there's our destination. Well, along this path, what can possibly go wrong? Well, maybe during the postal code lookup, it was looking up a code that didn't exist. Okay? In fact, let's do that right now. I'm going to just open up my text pad, and I put it under my temp directory. There's my file. Here it is right here. Let's change this zip code to be ones across the board. So I know for a fact that that does not exist in my lookup table. So I'll save that, and we'll go ahead and debug this, and we should get an error. There we go. So how can we handle this? Do we want everything to croak if something goes wrong, or do we want it to just ignore the lookup and carry on? Do we want it to set values to null? Okay, so there's several options here. I'm going to stop the debugging, and we'll go to our data flow right here. The postal code lookup, this is what we're interested in. Let's double click on this. And under General, you'll see this specifies how to handle rows with no matching entries. If we say ignore failure, and I want you to see what happens here. Let's go ahead and debug this again. Everything's green. If we query our data, you'll see what happened here. Let's just do a select star from contacts. You'll see that we have a null value right here. So when it performed the lookup, it didn't croak and say, I can't find the city and state. It just said, okay, couldn't find it, so we'll just set the city and state to null. Our other option, instead of ignoring it, we can tell it to go to an error output. In fact, I'm going to stop debugging right here. And we'll set this to say redirect rows to error output. And then for the error output, here's our lookup input and our lookup match. Okay, so here we have an error condition. What are we going to do? We're going to redirect row. Now this red arrow right here isn't pointing to anything. We want this to go to a file. So what we can do is go to our toolbox. We're going to add a flat file destination, and then we'll make sure that this red arrow is pointing to it. Move that down a little bit. Okay, there we go. We can double click on this flat file destination. Here's our connection manager. We can create a new connection manager. We'll just say that this is delimited. And we need to specify, we'll call this lookup error.txt. And so anytime that there's a lookup error, it's actually going to get redirected to this file right here. We can specify the format, the text qualifier, header row delimiter, and so on. In fact, we can also put column names in the first data row if we want to. Under columns, this is where we specify the characters that delimit the source file. Here's a preview of the different columns. And then under advanced, we can configure the properties. So we can change what these column names are, or you can just keep them the same. And once again, there's just a quick preview. So we'll just say OK on that. We go to our mappings, and this is the input. In other words, these are the things that came out of the lookup. Notice that we have a couple columns here, error code and error column. These are numeric pieces of information that give us meaningful information about what went wrong. There is a built-in function that will let us convert from the error code to a descriptive message. We'll hit OK on that. And now we can try this again. Okay, so we'll just say debug, start debugging. You'll see here that this is green as well. And that means that this got written to. Okay, so we can hit debug and stop debugging. Now what would be really helpful is if we actually saw data flowing from one task to another. Well, that's where the data viewer comes in handy. The data viewer just lets us intercept the actual data going from one task to another, and it just appears as a pop-up box and we can look at it. So I'm going to create a data viewer for data going from this unit here to this unit down here. So you just right-click on the arrow and you say Data Viewers. Under Data Viewers, you say Add, and we can choose Grid, that's the more popular one, or Histogram, Scatter Plot, Column Chart. The grid really shows us the actual data. Okay, and then for the grid information, we can specify which columns to display. So by default, all of them display. If we're not interested in all of them, we can of course move some over to this area right here. Let's just hit OK, stick with the default there, and then we'll say OK right there. Now you'll see this little icon. It means that, yes, we have a data viewer. Now let's try this again. I'm going to debug this. And you'll see that this popped open real quick. This is the data flowing from the extract from contacts file to the postal code lookup. We can hit detach so it can go on with the next step. We can also copy data so we can paste it somewhere else. I'm going to X out that window, and there you go. So you can have several data viewers scattered throughout your diagram here. It just helps us peek into this information. Another nice little tool we can use are our breakpoints. This comes in handy when you're dealing with your debugger, so you can step through one step at a time. I'm going to go ahead and turn this debugger off. And if you haven't already done so, delete from contacts or whatever table you're dealing with so you don't violate primary keys. And the way we set breakpoints is just right-click on this screen right here and say Edit Breakpoints. Okay, so here is where we can set our different breakpoints. So I'm going to set a couple breakpoints. I'm going to do a breakpoint on the OnPostExecute event and on the OnProgress event. And we hit OK. At this point, under the debugger, I can say Start Debugging. And so you'll see that we're here in the yellow, which means it's currently executing. If I want to go on to the next step, I can just say Continue, and I can keep doing that. In fact, this icon right up here lets us do that. So I had to go through that loop as many times as there were records. Okay, and so here is, once again, our data viewer. And I'm just going to exit out of there. We can keep continuing. And eventually you get to the point where it is finished. Oh, and by the way, if you want to turn those breakpoints off, you want to get rid of them, just go to Debug and say Delete all breakpoints. Or you can disable them. I'm going to choose Delete. Now, the last thing I want to talk to you about are transactions and checkpoints. And I think the best way to explain this concept is if I have 3 different tasks and you can see the relationship between the 3 when they're inside of a transaction. So I'm just going to close this project and I'm going to create a new one. New project. And I'll call this Transaction Test. Now what I'll put on here are 3 different tasks. So here's my toolbox, and we'll just make this an execute SQL task, 3 of them in a row. So one of them is right here, and we'll just stick with the default names. If you double click on it, you can see the SQL source type. We'll say direct input, and then we can provide the SQL statement. So we might do, for example, an insert into postal codes with values of, maybe we have a postal code of 80403, and we'll call that Netherlands, Colorado. And the postal codes table has this column here for the states, and it has to be a chart of 2 characters. So if we do something like put in the word Colorado, it will fail. This particular statement here is actually okay. So we'll say okay on that. Then we're going to, for our connection, we'll just say new connection. And here's our data connection, and we'll hit OK. We'll do the same thing 2 more times. Execute SQL task. The only difference here is that the SQL statements will be slightly different. So we'll just paste some stuff in there, and then maybe we'll put in here Broomfield. And let's literally type out the word Colorado, just to force a failure. Connection once again will be Johnson. There we go. Make sure that our arrows are going from one to the other. And then one more execute SQL task. And let's put in something that is actually good. So we'll say 80402, which is also Golden, Colorado. And hit OK and make sure that we have arrows going right here. What should happen, what the default behavior is this task will execute just fine. It gets to this task, it croaks, and this task never gets executed. The disturbing behavior here is that this first task never rolls back. I'll show you. Let's execute this, and you'll see that's green, oops, red, and nothing here because it never gets reached. Okay, so remember this first task here was saying to insert this record where it's 80403 Netherlands. Let's take a look at our actual data. If we do a select star from postal codes, I'll bring this over here, SQL Server Management Studio. Look how 80403 Netherlands did get in here. We want it to roll back. Okay, so let's do something real quickly. We'll delete from postal codes where postal equals 80403. Let's go ahead and get rid of that because we want to execute it again, this time with a transaction. Hit debug again, stop debugging. Now I'm looking at my control flow area here. If I just click anywhere in here but not specifically on a task, if I just click in here, if you scroll down, you'll see where it says transaction option supported. If we change that to say required, it just means that everything is required to be inside of a transaction. So let's run this again, see what happens. Look at that. Execute SQL, task 1 failed. And let's see what is in our actual table. So if we take our SQL Server Management Studio and we select star from postal codes, you'll see that Netherlands never got in there because it rolled back once the second task failed. Okay, so that's fine. That's how our transactions work. Instead of everything rolling back, what if we wanted to continue where we left off if something goes wrong without rolling back? Well, what we want to do first of all is set this back to its original value. So let's stop the debugging. And we're going to right click on here, go to Properties, make sure that we set the transaction option back to not supported. And so to implement checkpointing, just make sure that you have the package itself highlighted. You can just click on here, and then you can scroll up. Under here, the checkpoint file name. The reason why we need a file name is that when we have checkpointing, it's going to keep all of the status information in a special file. And so we can let's just put this directly under the C drive, and we'll call this the checkpoint file .txt. Checkpoint usage, we want to make sure that we say if exists. In other words, it will attempt checkpointing if that file exists. Save checkpoints, we want to make sure that's set to true to turn it on. Now, hone in on this execute SQL task. Once again, make sure that this fail package on failure, you want to say true. So I'm going to save this, and now we'll try to run it. So start our debugging. You'll see that that succeeded, that did not, and that didn't even get touched. Let's clear this, and we're going to run it again, and you'll see where it continued off. So we'll say stop debugging. Before we execute this sequence of tasks again, we want to make sure that the stuff inside of this task gets corrected. So I'll just double click on that. We go to the insert statement, and I'll change that from Colorado to be CO. And then we hit OK. So that shouldn't throw any errors. So at this point, if we execute this, notice how it started right here and it carried on. The reason why it started at the midpoint is because we put a checkpoint right there. I will turn off debugging. If you want to delete any of your checkpoints, just make sure you have the proper thing highlighted. Go into here and say fail package on failure. Just say that is false. And then you can save it. Now there's just one more thing I want to talk to you about generally about these tasks. Sometimes these tasks cannot be validated during development time. For example, there might be a database connection that you don't have access to right now, but you know you will have access to it in the production environment. So how do you delay the validation? Well, you can click any of your tasks here, and you can always just, under delay validation, choose true instead. So that pretty much wraps up troubleshooting and error handling. Let's review what we learned in this nugget. We first of all talked about logging. Remember, to set up logging, you need to specify the log location, what type of logging it is, for example, whether it's text or XML or a database table, and then you need to specify which events you're logging. Then we configured error output. Anytime you have those red arrows, it means that you're configuring the error output, and you can have that dumped to a file if you want. Or you can even transform it to some other format and then dumped somewhere else. We took a look at the data viewer. The data viewer is a way to intercept data going from one task to another. We had our debugger, where you can step through different tasks. And then the last thing we talked about was transactions and checkpointing. If you have a transaction set, then anything inside of that transaction, if it fails, everything gets rolled back. Now with checkpointing, you can set a specific checkpoint, which is like a save location, and then if something fails, you can always continue from that point on the next iteration of the execution. Well, I hope this has been informative, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.